Picture this. You wake up one morning, swing your legs off the bed, stand up, and immediately your lower back makes a sound that suggests it has opinions about this. You shuffle to the bathroom, squinting against the light because your eyes haven't adjusted yet. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror. Note with mild concern that you look exactly like someone who didn't sleep well, and proceed to choke slightly on your toothpaste because your airway and your food pipe share an entrance that seems, in retrospect, like a design choice someone should have caught in review. You eat breakfast too fast and get hiccups. Your knees hurt on the stairs. You spend 8 hours sitting in a position your spine was not engineered to sustain. You get a headache from staring at a screen. By mid-afternoon, your blood sugar drops in a way that turns you temporarily into a different, worse person. And somewhere around the third hour of lying awake at 2 in the morning because your brain decided that 2 a.m. was the ideal time to revisit every embarrassing thing you've ever done, you might find yourself wondering, was any of this supposed to happen? The answer, in the most evolutionary sense, is some of it yes, some of it no, and almost all of it is more interesting than it first appears. Because the catalog of ways that evolution has left ancient and modern humans with bodies that are imperfect, compromised, or outright counterproductive is not a list of random failures. It is the specific, legible record of every compromise, shortcut, and historical constraint that the evolutionary process accumulated across hundreds of millions of years of biological history. Each one tells a story, and the story is usually more fascinating than simply evolution got it wrong. Start with the foundational principle that explains why evolution produces imperfect outcomes even when given billions of years to work with. Because without this principle, the catalog of failures looks like carelessness rather than what it actually is. Evolution is not an engineer. Engineers start with a blank page, a set of requirements, and the freedom to design a system optimized for its intended purpose from scratch. Evolution starts with whatever already exists, can only modify what's there through the mechanism of heritable variation and differential reproduction, cannot plan ahead, cannot temporarily reduce fitness to reach a better long-term outcome, and cannot scrap a design and start over regardless of how much more efficient starting over would be. The result is that every organism is a modified version of its ancestors, constrained by all the historical decisions, most of which weren't decisions at all but random mutations that happened to survive, that preceded it. The human body is a modified fish, modified into an amphibian, modified into a reptile, modified into a mammal, modified into a primate, modified through the recent history of the hominin lineage. Every modification was made to an existing system that was already doing something, and the new modification had to work while the existing system was still running. This is why evolution produces the class of failure called historical constraint. Design limitations not because a better solution was unavailable in principle, but because the better solution was inaccessible from the starting point without an intermediate stage that would have been immediately lethal. Understanding this principle transforms the catalog of evolutionary failures from evidence of biological incompetence into evidence of the specific path that life has walked. A path with real costs, some of which ancient humans paid for in suffering and death. Bipedalism is the defining characteristic of the hominin lineage, and the adaptation that most directly generated a cascade of costly physiological consequences that ancient humans lived and died with across millions of years. Walking upright on 2 legs solved a genuine problem. It freed the hands for tool use, reduced heat exposure to direct solar radiation by minimizing the body surface facing the sun, and enabled the long-distance endurance locomotion that eventually made persistence hunting possible. These are real benefits that provided real selective advantages. The problem is that bipedalism was built on top of a quadrupedal skeleton that was already committed to a different structural logic, and the modifications required to convert a quadruped into a biped created structural compromises that were never fully resolved. The human spine is the most discussed victim of this compromise. Quadrupedal mammals use the spine primarily as a horizontal beam, a compression element supported at both ends by limbs, with the internal organs hanging from it like objects from a bridge. The forces are distributed along the length of the structure and managed efficiently by a horizontal architecture evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Bipedalism converted this horizontal beam into a vertical column, bearing the full weight of the upper body in compression, with the internal organs now pressing against the abdominal wall rather than hanging from the spine, and with the curvatures of the human spine, the lumbar lordosis and cervical lordosis that give the modern human spine its S-curve, added as structural adaptations to bring the center of mass over the hips for balance. The S-curve works, after a fashion, but it creates high-stress zones, particularly in the lower lumbar vertebrae where the curve changes direction, and where compression and shear forces combine in ways that damage intervertebral discs over time. The discs themselves, the cartilaginous cushions between vertebrae, are structures evolved for a horizontal loading pattern that are now experiencing vertical vertical compression for which they were not originally designed. Lower back pain in humans is not a modern lifestyle disease, although sedentary modern life makes it worse. It is visible in the skeletal remains of ancient humans across the hominin lineage, in Australopithecines, in Homo erectus, in Neanderthals. Ancient humans carried heavy loads, walked enormous distances, and gave birth through a bipedalism-compromised pelvis, all while dealing with the same spinal architecture that sends modern people to chiropractors. The birth canal is the starkest and most consequential structural failure in the human body, a compromise between two competing evolutionary pressures that found no clean solution and instead produced an outcome that killed ancient humans with brutal regularity. The bipedal pelvis required narrowing relative to the quadrupedal ancestral form. The mechanics of upright walking require a pelvic geometry that, in its optimized form for locomotion efficiency, produces a birth canal significantly narrower than the optimal for birthing large-headed infants. Meanwhile, selection pressure for larger brains that produced the cognitive capacities that gave Homo sapiens their ecological advantage, drove progressive expansion of the skull in fetuses that needed to pass through that narrow canal. The collision of these two pressures produced the obstetric dilemma. Human infants are born at a developmental stage that is, by primate standards, absurdly premature. A human newborn is neurologically and physically equivalent to a fetal stage that other primates spend several more months in utero completing. This premature birth allows the skull to exit the birth canal before it has expanded to its full adult size. But it means that human newborns are extraordinarily dependent for a period lasting months to years, helpless, requiring constant care, incapable of independent survival in any environment. The birth process itself, in ancient humans without any medical assistance, was and remains one of the most dangerous events in human biology. The rotation required for the infant's head to navigate the birth canal's changing dimensions is a uniquely human complication. Most primates birth infants that face the mother during emergence, allowing the mother to guide the infant out and clear the airway. Human infants emerge facing away from the mother, making self-assisted birth essentially impossible. The consequences of this anatomy were visible in the skeletal record. Ancient human females show evidence of birth-related skeletal damage, and mortality in childbirth among ancient humans was high enough to represent a significant selective pressure in its own right. The evolutionary partial response, increasingly dependent infants supported by increasingly intensive alloparental care from fathers, kin, and community members, solved the survival problem but created a social dependency that ancient humans had to manage without the cognitive infrastructure to plan for it explicitly. The infant that was too helpless to survive without sustained multi-person care required a social system sophisticated enough to provide that care reliably, which in turn required the kind of extended social bonds and cooperative behavior that are uniquely human. The birth canal compromise thus drove, indirectly, some of the most distinctively human social characteristics. The crossed airway and food passage is the evolutionary failure that gets the most attention in popular discussions of bad biological design, and with good reason, because it kills people in a way that seems spectacularly avoidable in retrospect. The human pharynx, the throat region behind the nose and mouth, serves as a shared passage for both the respiratory and digestive systems. Air traveling to the lungs and food, or liquid traveling to the stomach, both pass through the same space before being directed by the epiglottis, a small flap of tissue that is supposed to cover the trachea during swallowing to prevent food from entering the airway. This arrangement works most of the time. The epiglottis is a functional structure, and humans swallow thousands of times daily without choking. But the arrangement is architecturally unnecessary. Fish and other animals with gills have completely separate passages for breathing and eating, and the evolutionary modification that converted gill arches into the mammalian throat created the merged passage as a byproduct of the anatomical transformation rather than as a deliberate design choice. In ancient humans, the choking risk was managed by the same mechanism that manages it today, the epiglottis reflex. But the consequences of failure were categorically different. Aspiration of food particles into the airway without any medical intervention available is a death sentence through aspiration pneumonia, if not immediate asphyxiation. Ancient humans with any degree of dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, which increases with age and certain neurological conditions, were at genuine survival risk from a structural arrangement that could have been avoided if evolution had been able to design from scratch rather than modify an existing system. The descended larynx in adult humans, which creates the expanded pharyngeal space that enables the complex vocalizations of human speech, made the choking problem worse. The larynx descends during human development relative to its position in infants and other primates, expanding the resonating chamber that allows the full full range of speech sounds, but simultaneously increasing the length of the common airway food passage and the consequences of epiglottis failure. Ancient humans paid for language with an increased choking risk, and the trade-off was worthwhile at the population level while being individually catastrophic for those who lost the personal lottery. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The appendix occupies a peculiar position in discussions of evolutionary failure. It has been used as the canonical example of a vestigial and useless organ for so long that the more recent evidence for its having a function has barely dented the popular conception. The appendix is a small finger-shaped outgrowth from the cecum, the junction between the small and large intestine that in herbivorous mammals serves as a fermentation chamber for plant material. In those species, it is large and functional. In humans and other primates with more omnivorous diets, it has reduced dramatically in size over evolutionary time, and its digestive function is essentially absent. The evolutionary trajectory is one of progressive reduction, a structure being retained despite declining functional importance, presumably because the cost of having it is low enough that selection against it is weak. The cost is occasionally appendicitis, inflammation of the appendix that, without surgical intervention, progresses to rupture and peritonitis. In ancient humans without any surgical capability, a ruptured appendix was essentially universally fatal. Archaeological and paleopathological analysis has found evidence of healed appendicitis in ancient skeletal remains. Individuals who survived because their immune systems managed to wall off the infection. But acute appendicitis with rupture left ancient humans without recourse. Modern evidence does suggest the appendix has a residual immune function, serving as a reservoir of beneficial gut bacteria that can repopulate the colon after diarrheal illness. This function would have had adaptive value in ancient humans with high rates of enteric disease and no probiotics. Whether this function explains the appendix's retention, or whether it is simply a beneficial consequence of a structure being retained for other reasons, is not definitively resolved. What is clear is that the appendix represents a structure on the evolutionary trajectory from functional to vestigial, captured in a state where it is occasionally dangerous enough to be lethal without being functionless enough to have been eliminated by selection. The immune system's tendency toward overreaction produced consequences for ancient humans that are less visible in the skeletal record, but were profoundly consequential for survival. The immune system is a solution to an extremely difficult problem, distinguishing between self and non-self reliably enough to attack pathogens without attacking the body's own tissues, while maintaining the flexibility to recognize novel pathogens it has never previously encountered. This problem has no perfect solution. The immune system's developmental processes that produce self-tolerance, the ability to distinguish the body's own proteins from foreign ones, are imperfect, and the rate of immune dysfunction in human populations reflects the fundamental difficulty of the problem. Autoimmune conditions, in which the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, are the most visible expression of this imperfection. Rheumatoid arthritis, which causes progressive destruction of joint tissue, is visible in the skeletal record of ancient humans in the characteristic joint damage it produces. Ancient individuals with rheumatoid arthritis in a subsistence environment faced progressive loss of the joint function that direct physical survival depended on: the ability to walk, to grip tools, to carry food and water. The immune system attacking the joints of an ancient human dependent on those joints for everything is evolution producing a specific, lethal category of failure from a system that was imperfect by construction. Sepsis, the dysregulated systemic immune response to infection that causes more damage than the infection it was supposed to combat, was one of the leading causes of death in ancient humans across every wound, childbirth complication, or infection that triggered it. The immune response that is supposed to contain infection locally instead becomes systemic, producing widespread inflammation that damages organs and disrupts the cardiovascular function necessary for survival. The physiology of sepsis is not a simple failure of the immune system to fight infection. It is the immune system fighting with such excessive force that the response itself becomes the lethal threat. Ancient humans died from this regularly and without any possible intervention. Vision is an area where evolutionary history produced a deeply counterintuitive structural decision that has consequences ranging from inconvenient to catastrophic. The vertebrate eye is wired backward. The photoreceptor cells, the rods and cones that actually detect light, point away from the incoming light in the vertebrate retina, with their light-sensitive surfaces facing the back of the eye. The nerve fibers connecting photoreceptors to the brain run across the front of the retina, between the photoreceptors and the incoming light. This arrangement requires the nerve fibers to gather into a bundle and pass through the retinal surface to exit the eye as the optic nerve, creating the blind spot, the area of the retina with no photoreceptors where the optic nerve exits. The blind spot is large enough that it should, in principle, produce a visible gap in the visual field. The brain fills it in using information from surrounding areas, which is why you don't normally notice it. But the filling in process is a workaround for a structural problem, not a solution to it. The vertebrate eye works despite its inverted architecture because the brain compensates for it, which is itself an additional computational cost imposed by the original structural choice. The inverted retina also creates structural vulnerability to retinal detachment. The retina can separate from the supporting tissue behind it because the physical connection between the photoreceptor layer and the underlying pigment epithelium is not reinforced by any structural attachment. Retinal detachment leads to vision loss that, in ancient humans, was irreversible. The detachment risk is a direct consequence of the inverted architecture, because a correctly wired retina would have no equivalent separation vulnerability. Ancient humans with significant myopia, nearsightedness, which is partially heritable, faced retinal detachment risk because myopia involves elongation of the eyeball that stretches the retina and increases the mechanical tension that leads to detachment. Vision loss in an ancient subsistence environment was not an inconvenience. It was a survival crisis of the first order, eliminating the capacity for hunting, for navigating unfamiliar terrain, for recognizing predators at distance, and for the social information processing that reading facial expressions requires. Dental evolution in the hominin lineage is a record of a system increasingly mismatched with the jaw that contains it, producing consequences that ancient humans experienced as chronic pain and infection throughout their lives. The hominin jaw progressively reduced in size over the course of the lineage's evolution. Smaller jaws were associated with smaller faces, which were associated with the forward rotation of the skull that accompanied brain expansion and bipedalism. The teeth, however, did not reduce at the same rate as the jaw. The result is that modern human jaws frequently lack the space to properly accommodate all 32 permanent teeth, with the third molars, wisdom teeth, being the most commonly affected. In ancient humans with somewhat larger jaws than modern populations, this problem was less acute than it is today. But archaeological and paleopathological analysis of ancient human dental remains consistently shows dental crowding, impaction, periodontal disease, and abscess formation at rates that represent a significant morbidity burden. Dental abscess in an ancient human without antibiotics could spread to adjacent bone tissue, produce septic infection, and kill. The skeletal record shows cases of dental abscesses severe enough to have eroded substantial amounts of jawbone in individuals who survived the acute phase through immune function, but who were living with chronic infection and presumably chronic pain. The dietary change associated with agriculture dramatically worsened the dental situation that natural jaw-tooth mismatch had already created. Softer, more processed foods reduced the mechanical stimulation that promotes jaw development during childhood, producing smaller jaws in agricultural populations relative to hunter-gatherer ancestors, and therefore more severe crowding and impaction. Increased dietary sugar and carbohydrate promoted dental caries at rates not seen in pre-agricultural populations. The agricultural revolution, in dental terms, was a health catastrophe whose effects are still playing out in the mouths of every person who requires orthodontics or wisdom tooth extraction. Sleep architecture is a domain where the evolutionary heritage of ancient humans created vulnerabilities that modern medicine now treats as disorders, but that were simply facts of life, and sometimes causes of death. Across the entire human evolutionary history, sleep is divided into stages, including slow-wave deep sleep and the distinct phase of rapid eye movement sleep. That cycle through the night in a pattern whose disruption has measurable consequences for immune function, metabolic regulation, memory consolidation, and cardiovascular health. Ancient humans slept in groups, in environments where predator threats required the ability to rouse quickly, and where the social dynamics of group living produced disturbances that modern controlled sleep environments don't replicate. Sleep apnea the interruption of breathing during sleep due to airway collapse, has a significant genetic component and was presumably present in ancient human populations. The short-term consequences of sleep apnea are chronic sleep fragmentation and resulting daytime impairment. The long-term cardiovascular consequences, elevated blood pressure, increased risk of cardiac arrhythmia, elevated stroke risk, were real biological costs that ancient individuals with sleep apnea carried, potentially limiting their productive lifespan even in the absence of any acute illness. The brain's insistence on processing emotional memories during REM sleep, a function crucial for emotional regulation, creates the vulnerability to nightmares and intrusive nocturnal processing of traumatic experience that ancient humans with high rates of physical trauma, predator encounters, and violence-related stress would have experienced extensively. Trauma exposure in ancient humans was not rare. The same neural architecture that processes traumatic memory during sleep can, under conditions of severe or repeated trauma, produce the dysregulated sleep and hyperarousal that characterizes PTSD, a condition that was presumably as present in ancient populations as the traumas that cause it. The synthesis of all of this is not that evolution failed ancient humans in the sense of producing bodies that were inadequate for the environments they lived in. Ancient humans survived, reproduced, and eventually colonized the entire planet, which is not the track record of a fundamentally failed biological design. The more precise framing is that evolution produced ancient human bodies that were adequately functional for survival and reproduction under the specific conditions of the ancestral environment, while carrying costs, vulnerabilities, and compromises that produced real suffering, real mortality, and real limitations that a truly optimal design would have avoided. The lower back pain, the difficult childbirth, the choking risk, the impacted wisdom teeth, the blind spot, the dysregulated immune responses, none of these eliminated the lineage, but all of them killed individuals and degraded the quality of life for countless others. Ancient humans lived shorter lives than they might have with better designed bodies. They died from childbirth complications that better pelvic architecture would have prevented. They suffered chronic pain from spines doing structural jobs they were never originally intended to do. They lost teeth and developed fatal abscesses from jaw-tooth mismatches they had no mechanism to correct. They died from appendicitis, from sepsis triggered by overreactive immune responses, from retinal detachment in eyes wired the wrong way around. Evolution didn't fail them catastrophically. It failed them specifically, repeatedly, and with a specificity that reflects the actual history of the modifications that produced the human body from its biological predecessors. The failures are the footprints of the process, and the process, for all its inefficiency and compromise and accumulated historical baggage, produced a species that eventually understood enough about its own imperfect biology to start fixing the failures its ancestors had no choice but to endure, which is either deeply impressive or exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a species whose brain evolved to solve problems, even when the problem is the brain's own evolutionary origin story.